New York City's mafia, an organization of brutal gangs. To gain wealth and power, members strong-arm businesses and kill anyone in their way. John Gotti was one of organized crime's fiercest members. He wanted to rule New York City. The FBI had to stop him.
John Gotti was ambitious, powerful, and ruthless. He ruled with flash and conspicuous style, playing celebrity with the media and cat and mouse with the FBI. They called John Gotti the Teflon Don. Serious charges just wouldn't stick. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. When John Gotti came to power in 1985, organized crime still had its tentacles spread into many legitimate businesses. Like a game of chess, crime bosses were well insulated by layers of pawns. The FBI's job was to penetrate their defenses and capture the king.
New York is the home of organized crime in America. Through intimidation, terror, and murder, the 5 families that make up New York's mafia have corrupted labor unions, run extortion rackets, and infiltrated almost every major industry in the city. Disputes among the crime families often erupt over who controls which union or what industry. These disputes are inevitably and violently resolved. By the 1970s, the Gambino family had emerged as the most violent and the most powerful crime family in the nation. As that decade came to an end, the FBI decided it was time to stop the mafia's reign of terror. The Bureau's New York office set up 5 squads assigned to investigate and bring down each criminal family. Special Agent Bruce Mouw was assigned to supervise the squad responsible for bringing down the Gambino family.
The Bureau realized that we really weren't addressing organized crime here in New York, and so they formed squads to target each particular crime family and try to address the organized crime problem here in New York. So in 1980 we formed the squad, and our target was to put the Gambino family in jail.
The main targets of Mouw's investigation were the leaders of the Gambino family. The boss, Paul Castellano, and his underboss, Neil Della Croce. Castellano assumed leadership of the family in 1976, when Carlos Gambino, the namesake of the family, died of natural causes. The FBI were also targeting the most powerful captains in the family, like John Gotti. The captains controlled crews of soldiers who carried out the day-to-day criminal activity for the family. Castellano's crews would commit the actual crimes, but Castellano himself did not. Catching him seemed impossible. As the FBI soon learned, the entire hierarchy of the Gambino family was well insulated. The family army consisted of over 50 captains who controlled over 300 soldiers. It was a large and impenetrable secret society, accessible to outsiders only through the lenses of surveillance cameras. But federal racketeering legislation was passed that made ordering criminal acts as much of a crime as committing the crime itself. In order to successfully prosecute the hierarchy of the Gambino family, the FBI had to secretly get them on tape discussing their criminal enterprise. Mouw and his team would have to patiently and methodically work their way into the intricate structure of the Gambino family. It would take years to accomplish that goal. Agents tried to learn more by speaking to residents in the neighborhoods where mob activity was prevalent.
You sure now? Yeah. Well, take a look. You might recognize one of these guys. Take a look. Take a good look. Take your time.
Few people were willing to talk. Only those on the inside could tell agents who were the real power brokers in the family. Cooperating witnesses and informants had to be developed. Betraying the mafia meant certain death. Informants would be difficult to come by. But some were willing to take the risk. Most were low-level criminals cutting deals with the government to avoid prosecution and long prison sentences. Whatever their motivation, they gave agents something they did not have before: a back door into the Gambino family's criminal operations. Castellano ran the family like a major corporation. Nicknamed within the mafia as the Pope, he used unions to strengthen his grip on various industries in New York. Louis Schilero, head of the FBI's New York office, is an expert on organized crime.
One of the most influential things that the Gambino family did was the control of the labor unions in New York City. They exerted at one time tremendous influence in terms of the Longshoremen's Union, in terms of construction industry, trade unions, and in terms of the Teamsters and trucking. By controlling the trade unions in New York City, the Gambino family was able to control construction and certainly had a great influence in the garment center. And that generated tremendous amount of financial base to the family.
You know, that's paper trail.
Castellano knew how to keep his interests under control.
Castellano also realized how important it was to rule by fear and terror, so he had several enforcement arms of the family. He had a crew that was famous for killing people, dismembering bodies, and doing all sorts of horrid things. So even though Castellano was known as a businessman's Don, he was a tough guy. He had a hair trigger and temper, and he'd kill you at the drop of a hat.
Getting to Castellano directly would be very difficult. His home in Staten Island was a fortress, under constant supervision by armed guards. He had also installed a sophisticated alarm system.
Didn't you tell me that?
Agents had no solid evidence to suggest that Castellano conducted criminal business in his home. Without such proof, a court would never authorize an FBI bug or a phone wiretap inside the home. Agents hit the streets. They hoped to find one weak link to exploit, one person in the family who made himself vulnerable to electronic surveillance. They learned through informants about a Gambino family crew headed by John Gotti that operated in Queens, headquartered in a private social club called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. A few of the FBI's well-placed informants were close to one of Gotti's lieutenants, a man named Angelo Ruggiero. Though known on the streets as the most vicious gang in the Gambino family, agents believed they found their weak link in Gotti's crew.
And the reason we did was he had a lieutenant named Angelo Ruggiero who ran the day-to-day operations for Gotti and his crew. And Angelo was an attractive target because, number one, he's very active, involved in a lot of criminal activity. Number two, he had a big mouth. He talked a lot. He was a gossip and a blabbermouth.
Mouw quickly established surveillance teams to identify, record, and log every person who entered the Bergen Club. Agents learned that John Gotti and his crew made money for the family primarily through hijacking, car thefts, extortion, and illegal gambling operations. Informants told agents that Ruggiero sometimes discussed family business on his daughter's phone. He believed the line listed in her name to be free of FBI bugs. Permission to wiretap a private telephone is granted sparingly. Agents must convince a federal judge that the target is engaged in criminal activities and that the wiretap is likely to produce more evidence. If conversations are not of a criminal nature, the wiretap must be turned off. The informant's statements were enough to convince a federal judge in late 1981 that Ruggiero's daughter's phone should be tapped. Mouw's squad had found a way to infiltrate the Gambino family. The wiretapping of Ruggiero's phone proved to be one of the most successful wiretaps in FBI history. The conversations overheard by the FBI were damning. But agents learned that Ruggiero also held meetings in his home with Gambino members. Mouw and his squad had enough evidence to justify placing a microphone in Ruggiero's home. Agents slipped in, installed the bugs in his dining room, and left without a trace. The success of the Mafia has always been its ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. What Mouw and his squad did not know was that a high-ranking police officer was on the Gambino payroll. Though the mole didn't know specific details, he leaked information to family members about ongoing investigations and electronic surveillance operations. Angelo Ruggiero became paranoid that his house was bugged. He searched the house himself, but found nothing. Unconvinced, he called in a professional to conduct a thorough search or sweep for bugs.
Yeah, I need someone to come sweep my house, please.
Ruggiero ordered the sweep on the tapped
2345.
telephone. When the FBI heard the conversation, they knew they had a crisis.
2345 Richmond Street.
Got a problem.
The phone tap inside the home was immediately turned off to avoid detection.
All that work.
If discovered, it would destroy weeks of diligent work and send the squad back to square one. And there were no targets as talkative as Ruggiero.
Yeah, just come right here. Okay.
The sweeper arrived with the most sophisticated electronic detection equipment available.
Yeah, sounds good.
After 2 days of searching the house top to bottom, he was ready to report his findings to Ruggiero. 2 days after Ruggiero's house was searched for bugs, agents arrested the man who conducted the sweep of his house. What they learned was indeed shocking. He charged Ruggiero thousands of dollars for his services, but none of his detection equipment worked. He had swindled the mob. Fortunately, he had told Ruggiero his house was clean. It was a lucky break for the FBI. Not only had their bugs not been discovered, but now Ruggiero felt confident to speak freely in his house. And he did so with abandon, right into the FBI microphones. Slowly, the FBI was getting closer to the Gambino family hierarchy. To agents, the conversations were a gold mine. As Ruggiero met with his mob partners, the FBI learned of a major heroin trafficking operation conducted by Ruggiero and John Gotti's younger brother, Eugene. Over a 6-month period, Angelo and Eugene Gotti had distributed over 50 kilos of heroin in New York alone. The FBI had every last detail on tape. There was a mafia rule in effect that dealing drugs was strictly prohibited. The punishment for getting caught was execution. No appeal, no trial. Ruggiero did not have the boss's permission to deal drugs, and he knew the consequences. The government felt it had a strong case against Ruggiero and Eugene Gotti. In September of 1983, they were charged with running a major heroin distribution network and obstruction of justice. Though all of those indicted were part of John Gotti's crew, his name was not mentioned in the taped conversations. But with the indictment, Castellano would soon find out that Gotti's men were dealing drugs. Learning of the heroin operation, however, was not the only valuable piece of information learned by agents. Just prior to his heroin indictment, Ruggiero would meet with other soldiers and discuss how he and John Gotti would go to Paul Castellano's house every Sunday for a family meeting.
And then Angelo would give him a blow-by-blow what happened in Paul's house. The Pope did this, the Pope did that, he's mad at this guy. Everything's going in the family, we found out through Angelo's big mouth. And then next day, other soldiers would come over. Of course, Angelo had to reconstruct what happened again. So we found everything was happening in the Gambino family, thanks to Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti, and Paul Castellano.
Based on the Ruggiero wire, agents now had probable cause to bug the house of Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Getting into Castellano's house took detailed planning and methodical execution. Agents managed to get inside the house and place the bugs. Soon after, they began taping conversations that directly implicated Paul Castellano as the boss of the Gambino family, the man who oversaw a multitude of illegal rackets that cost taxpayers millions of dollars each year. Castellano would meet with his most trusted captains to discuss business. The FBI identified one of those captains as Sammy the Bull Gravano. As his nickname implied, the Bull was both strong and aggressive. He was a boxer and a bodybuilder. He was also the family's top enforcer. Gravano generated his money for the family in the construction industry. He was adept at a number of criminal activities, but his most notorious skill was murder. As the FBI continued to investigate powerful captains in the family like John Gotti and Sammy the Bull, their sights remained focused on the boss. In 1985, 2 years after Ruggiero was indicted, Paul Castellano was arrested and charged along with other New York family bosses with dozens of federal racketeering and conspiracy violations. Out on bail, Castellano continued to run the family, though his attention seemed focused on how to beat the government's case against him. John Gotti was also facing his own legal troubles. An independent investigation led by the U.S. Attorney's Office ended with Gotti and his mentor, underboss Neil Della Croce, being charged with several counts of racketeering. Della Croce and Gotti were released on bail, allowing them to continue their criminal operations. Months later, Della Croce lay dying of cancer. The FBI had bugged his bedroom. Gotti and Ruggiero visited, and the FBI was listening. They recorded Gotti talking about his fears that Castellano might kill him and Ruggiero for getting caught on tape discussing their drug dealings and for leading the FBI to Castellano's house. The boss wanted to hear the FBI tapes. Della Croce promised Gotti that he would do anything in his power to protect him. Della Croce's loyalty to Gotti was causing a rift in the family.
One more time. That's all I'm asking.
He was stalling the boss, reluctant to turn the tapes over to Castellano. The Gambino family was splitting in two. Then, in early December of 1985, Neil Della Croce, the Gambino family's second in command, died of cancer in his home. On December 16th, 2 weeks after Della Croce's death, Castellano and his new underboss, Tommy Bellano, pulled up to a fashionable steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan to meet some associates for dinner. As they started to exit the car, several men approached them and began firing. Castellano and Bellotti never knew what hit them. They were killed instantly. When the boss of a family is assassinated, the FBI believes that the person responsible is usually the one who steps up and assumes leadership of the family. It was mafia tradition to pay tribute to a new boss, to show him respect. 2 weeks after the murder, agents watched a parade of high-level Gambino family members enter the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. They were meeting with John Gotti. Agent Mouw and his squad would have to restructure their attack on the Gambino hierarchy. John Gotti was the new boss of the family.
Maybe.
Agents pieced together his criminal history and traced his rise to power. John Gotti became a Gambino family associate around 1970. He impressed the boss in 1973 by killing a man who had kidnapped and murdered a relative of Carlos Gambino. Gotti served 2 years for the hit before he was paroled. Upon his release, he quickly gained respect within the family. He began to make a great deal of money for the family through loan sharking and gambling operations. In his neighborhood, he became a hero of sorts, throwing huge 4th of July parties every year, complete with fireworks. Special Agent George Gabriel was assigned to Mao's squad in 1985. He quickly became an expert on John Gotti.
He took care of if there were old ladies that were in need. If he had money in his pocket, he'd give it out. He was, in some respects, a Robin Hood in his neighborhood. And that's how he carried himself. But how did he make that money? By killing, by robbing, by manipulating, by bribing, by controlling rackets that he didn't have a right to control. And that's a side, when he didn't like you, when you fell on the wrong side of John, you died. I mean, there was no mercy. You died. There was no two ways about it.
Gotti was now the king. He found himself in command of a multi-million-dollar crime network made up of scams he did not know existed. He had a lot to learn. With their bugs and surveillance, Special Agent Gabriel and the rest of the FBI squad learned right along with him.
John Gotti took over that family. He had to learn what the rackets were, and as he's learning them, we're learning them. Who's got what industries, who's collecting from what unions. He's asking captains to give him a list of all the soldiers in their crews, so he could know who he's got in his family and how many.
Gotti was the boss, but he still had legal troubles. 6 months after becoming the head of the family, he was sent to jail to await trial on loan sharking and gambling charges. Jail didn't slow him down, though. From his cell, Gotti ordered a murder. It was against Robert DiBernardo, who had been a close associate of Gotti. DiBernardo's assassination was set up by Angelo Ruggiero, who was still awaiting trial for his 1983 drug indictment.
Angelo's one of the few guys who's got access to John in jail and tells him that Robert DiBernardo is talking subversive behind John's back, the boss's back. He's saying that John isn't fit as the boss and we should appoint somebody else as the boss. Angelo wants this done because Angelo owes Robert DiBernardo a lot of money and he doesn't want to pay him back.
I was going over some of these contracts here. This public housing contract.
On Gotti's behalf, Ruggiero asked Sammy the Bull Gravano to set up the hit.
You want some coffee?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Give me some coffee, will you?
On June 5th, 1986, DiBernardo showed up for a meeting at Gravano's construction office. Everyone greeted him as usual. DiBernardo must have suspected nothing.
You know we got all those contracts.
He was shot in the head from behind. His body was never found. The FBI learned of his death through informants. Agents believed Gotti's crew was responsible for the murder, but they needed proof. In August of '96, 2 months after the DiBernardo hit, Gotti went to trial for the gambling and loan sharking charges filed 2 years before. But Gotti had not been the primary target of that indictment. The case was originally designed to bring down underboss Neil Della Croce. The case against Gotti was never that strong, but an ambitious U.S. attorney saw an opportunity to get a mob boss. Though the case did not involve Mouw's squad, he sent George Gabriel to observe the trial. During a break in the proceedings, Gabriel came face to face with his adversary.
I introduced myself. I told him I'm George Gabriel. I'm with the FBI. I work on Bruce Mouw's squad. He says, you tell him I'm going to be home in 6 weeks. I'm going to beat this one. I said, right, I'll deliver your message. I said, and if you do, I'll be there to congratulate you because it'll be a good job on your part. He says, good, I hope to see you.
On March 13th, 1987, Gotti was acquitted on all counts. George Gabriel made good on his promise. After the verdict, Gabriel went to the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, where Gotti was having an acquittal party. He congratulated Gotti. To the press, the public, and to prosecutors, John Gotti seemed untouchable. Out of jail, John Gotti resumed his celebrity status. Around town, he was seen at fine restaurants and glitzy nightclubs, always immaculately dressed. Already he was known as the Dapper Don. Now, with his acquittal, he earned the title of the Teflon Don. Charges slid right off him. To the media, he was glorified as the underdog who took on and beat the government. But now, it was Mouw's turn to make a case against Gotti.
I get upset when they glorify a guy like that. To me, he's just a common thug, a criminal. He's a terrorist. He doesn't believe in our government. He doesn't believe in voting, doesn't believe in church, he doesn't believe in family. He's a mass murderer. How can you glorify this guy and make him a role model for your kids? It's very upsetting to me.
In order to make his case against Gotti, Mouw had to find out where he was conducting his business. The FBI bugs planted at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club had dried up. Since becoming boss, Gotti wasn't spending as much time there. The squad leaned hard on informants to find out where Gotti held his high-level meetings. It took 8 months, but in early 1988, they finally found Gotti's new headquarters. Gotti turned the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy into his headquarters. It was a symbolic gesture on Gotti's part. The Ravenite was his mentor Neil Della Croce's old club. Here, Gotti would meet with his captains to conduct family business. Agents rented an apartment down the street from the Ravenite. A high-powered camera was installed to record all those who came and went from the club. In February of 1988, the FBI earned court approval to bug the Ravenite. With 30 or 40 people in the room, deciphering conversations was difficult. Cassette tape recordings of white noise were always being played in the club. Hearing conversations through that was impossible. But the FBI had to have John Gotti's orders on tape in order to charge him with running the Gambino family. So far, the bugs in the Ravenite had not produced much evidence. Gotti always suspected he was being listened to by the FBI, and he found clever ways to avoid being overheard.
John Gotti was notorious for going on what we described as a walk talk, where he and the person he had to discuss something secretive. Not all mob business is open to everybody in the mob. There were times where a captain would have to speak with his boss. John Gotti would take that person and they'd go outside. Going outside, they're evading the possibility of a bug.
No matter what agents did, it seemed the mob was anticipating their every move, at times even taunting them.
When I would sit in the van outside the Ravenite, they would bang on every van on the street and whisper, "We know you're in there." You get made all the time, and you try your darndest not to, but it happens. And you just have to stay with it.
John Gotti ordered another hit out of range of the FBI bugs. This time, it was Louis Melito, a Gambino soldier whose loyalty to Gotti was suspect. Gotti felt Melito was a threat to the family administration, since Melito had been a close business associate of Paul Castellano and Tommy Bilotti. Sammy the Bull agreed to oversee the hit. He too had little use for Melito. Sammy felt he was trying to move in on the construction industry. Melito was shot dead under Gravano's supervision, his body removed and never found. The FBI learned of the hit through informant rumors. But again, there was not enough hard evidence on Gotti to arrest him. Gotti was ordering people killed right under the FBI's nose. The cat-and-mouse game intensified, and so did the pressure on the FBI to stop him from ordering more killings. Mouw knew he was overlooking something. Gotti must be talking, but the FBI didn't know where. In December 1988, Bruce Mouw decided it was time to shut down the wire and regroup.
It was a very frustrating time because we knew we were so close. We had these guys on videotape. We could see them coming and going. We saw the walk talks around the street. We were so close, but yet so far away from achieving our goals.
The bugs were shut down, but the FBI's Gambino squad would not give up. They developed a new informant who told them Gotti would sometimes be in deep conversation with one of his men in the Ravenite. Then abruptly, they would leave the table and go into a hallway behind the club. Usually they were gone for 10 or 15 minutes. The meetings in the hall were no doubt incriminating ones. And in a quiet hallway, FBI bugs could pick up more of the conversations. The squad quickly took advantage of the opportunity. In October of 1989, agents bugged the hall. They recorded Gotti meeting with several Gambino family members there. The bug produced some evidence against Gotti, but not the evidence they needed to put him away for life. Gotti had to be meeting his men in another location within the building. Somewhere where he felt comfortable and safe. In the fall of 1989, agents learned from informants about another location within the building that Gotti frequented. Nettie Sorelli was a widow. Her husband, Michael, had been caretaker of the Ravenite Club. When he died, she remained in the apartment they shared, just 2 floors above the club. It was believed that Gotti used Mrs. Sorelli's apartment to talk about sensitive family business. Getting into Mrs. Sorelli's apartment undetected was going to be a problem. She rarely left. As the FBI's Special Operations Squad tried to figure a way in, agents learned that Mrs. Sorelli would be leaving town for the Thanksgiving holiday. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Agents went to work. They sneaked into the apartment in the middle of the night and placed the bugs. On November 30th, 1989, the first conversation taped in Mrs. Sorelli's apartment came over the wires. Crisp and clear, all participants talked freely. They spoke directly, using no code words or sign language like they often did when a bug was suspected. For weeks, agents listened in on the apartment conversations. On December 12, 1989, they got the biggest break they could ever have hoped for. That day, Gotti and his underboss, Frank Locascio, met at the apartment. In a rambling conversation, Gotti left a trail of evidence that would later haunt him. He explained labor union rackets and other crimes. And he talked about ordering the murders of several people. The agents monitoring Gotti that night could barely believe their ears. More shocking to agents was what they heard Gotti say about Sammy Gravano. For over an hour, Gotti went on a verbal rampage about Sammy. He said Gravano was getting greedy, taking too big of a cut from the construction racket profits. He was becoming too active in the family, not respecting Gotti's authority. Gotti suggested that 2 murders that he himself had ordered were because Sammy was trying to protect his own interests. According to Gotti, Sammy had suckered him into murdering DiBernardo and Melito.
It was a very important conversation because during this long diatribe, John confessed to 2 murders. He confessed to ordering the hit on Robert DiBernardo. He confessed to ordering the hit on Louis Melito. Both he claimed that Gravano's urging to have murdered. He also talked about a 3rd guy named Louis DeBono who was going to murder another partner of Sammy's. John detailed also his control of different labor unions. He also detailed how much money he's making from different illegal activities. It was our smoking gun. It was the best tape of the entire electronic surveillance.
After recording a few more conversations, the wire in the apartment was turned off in May of 1990. For Mouw's Gambino squad, all the years of patience had finally paid off. They had the best evidence they could imagine, and it was John Gotti himself. Over the next few months, agents put together their case against Gotti. The case against the Gambino family hierarchy, which began a decade earlier, was ready to come to a close. On December 12, 1990, exactly a year after Gotti's fateful conversation, Special Agent George Gabriel and 2 others went to the Ravenite Social Club. Their purpose was to arrest John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank Locascio. Backup officers were close behind, or so Gabriel thought.
When I went into the club to arrest them, they had just ordered coffee. And myself, my partner, and one of the police officers kind of accidentally went into the club ahead of the rest of the arrest team. We were about a minute ahead of everybody. So there we were on the classic, you know, we've got you surrounded, and we're looking behind us, and there was nobody there. There wasn't a problem. Everybody complied with what we asked for. And either John or Sammy asked if they can have their cup of coffee, and I said, yeah, go ahead. We got plenty of time before we leave.
On his way to be booked, Gotti asked Agent Gabriel what he was charged with. Gabriel ran down the list and told Gotti of the taped conversations, especially in the hallway in the apartment. At that, Gotti fell quiet. At a bail hearing a few days later, the three defendants heard excerpts from the FBI's tapes. They played a segment from the December 12th conversation. Sammy Gravano heard Gotti bashing his character.
For the first time in life, John Gotti was embarrassed. He was turning shades of blue and pink and trying to duck under the table. Sammy was turning red. You could tell he was hotter than a firecracker. And they kept looking at each other like, what's going on here? But that tape planted the seeds for the first time in Gravano's mind that he and John Gotti could never coexist, and one had to kill the other if they ever got out of jail.
After hearing the tape, Gravano realized Gotti's defense strategy would be to blame him for the murders. Gravano was being set up as the fall guy. On November 8, 1991, Gravano decided to cooperate with the FBI and tell them everything he knew about the Gambino family. He filled in all of the details that were missing from the recordings about how he and Gotti committed crimes on behalf of the Gambino family, and managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Gravano arranged payoffs to jurors and a high-level police officer who had been supplying Gotti with classified information. Both the jurors and the corrupt officer were indicted and given jail sentences. Gabriel finally learned why Gotti had been able to avoid successful prosecutions.
He's out there in everybody's face. I beat the government. They've got nothing on me. Reality was he bought the jury. Sammy Gravano paid a juror $60,000 to throw that case. And that's how he wins his case.
The question most in need of an answer concerned the Castellano assassination. Through Gravano, the FBI finally learned the truth. The seeds for Castellano's assassination were planted when Angelo Ruggiero and Eugene Gotti were indicted in the heroin distribution ring in 1983. The prohibited operation could no longer be kept quiet from the boss. Castellano learned that the government's case was based on FBI recordings of Ruggiero. Castellano was furious. He wanted to hear the tapes for himself. Events began to snowball.
In 1984, the tapes were finally turned over to the defense, and for the first time, all the co-defendants and defense attorneys had all these tapes of Angelo blabbing about heroin trafficking, meetings at Castellano's house, commission meetings, et cetera, et cetera. So, around 1984, Castellano, being the boss of the family, asked Ruggiero for a copy of the tapes.
The tension between Gotti and Castellano was held in check by Della Croce. But when Della Croce died, the barriers were down. A few days after Della Croce's death, Castellano summoned his captains for a meeting. Tommy Bellotti would replace Della Croce as underboss. More ominously, Castellano declared that Gotti's crew would be disbanded, his men absorbed into other crews. Castellano had finally listened to the Ruggiero tapes. They had given the government such a good case that after the trial, there probably wouldn't be much of a Gotti crew anyway. Gotti was furious, and he knew he was a target. There was grumbling among the ranks that Castellano was preoccupied with his legal problems and wasn't paying enough attention to the family. Some members thought he was pocketing too much money for himself, not spreading it around among the soldiers and captains. Gotti began to formulate his takeover. He had Angelo Ruggiero approach 3 of the 4 other mafia families. He wanted to know if they would look the other way if something were to happen to Castellano. The families said they would not interfere. Gotti carefully picked a few soldiers to help plan the hit. In particular, there was one Gambino member whose support would be crucial if the hit was going to succeed. Ruggiero was sent to ask Sammy Gravano if he would participate in the murder of Castellano. Gravano agreed. He was aware of the growing dissent within the family. He also knew that John Gotti was powerful enough to pull off the murder of the boss. And when the other families agreed to stay out of the way, Sammy knew the smart play was to back Gotti. Gotti put together a team of 5 Gambino family members to plan Castellano's assassination. They called themselves the Fist of 5. Hitting the boss of the Mafia's largest family was a formidable task. The Fist would have to find Castellano away from his loyalists. And they knew that Castellano was under constant law enforcement scrutiny. He must be hit someplace where the FBI was not apt to be following him. Their best opportunity came in mid-December 1985. Castellano had asked 5 of his captains to meet him for dinner at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. But one of the captains was a member of the Fist. The night before the planned hit, the Fist convened at a construction office used by Gravano. Four shooters had been hired, 2 for Castellano and 2 for his driver and underboss, Tommy Bellotti. The murders had been meticulously planned. On December 16th, the team gathered in a park about a mile from Sparks. The 4 shooters dressed alike, in black Russian hats and light-colored trench coats. If seen by witnesses, they were more likely to be remembered for what they wore rather than their faces. The primary shooters were to pair off just outside Sparks. Angelo Ruggiero was one of 4 backups who would block all avenues of escape. Gotti and Gravano would observe from down the street in their parked car, ready to shoot if necessary. If something went wrong, if they missed on the street, they were to move into Sparks, firing until Castellano and Bellotti were killed. No matter who got in the way, Castellano and Bellotti had to die. It was dusk when Gotti and Gravano headed towards Sparks Steakhouse. The shooters took their places. Gotti and Gravano soon found their vantage point, a parking space at an intersection down the street from the restaurant. They waited in the car. Castellano was late. Perhaps he'd been tipped off about the plot on his life. In the middle of a conversation with Gotti, Gravano suddenly looked to his left and panicked at what he saw. It was a black Lincoln with Bellotti at the wheel and Castellano beside him. For one moment, Gravano and Gotti thought they would be seen. But the light changed and the car moved on. Gravano radioed ahead. It was time. As Bellotti pulled the car to the curb, the assassins advanced. Paul Castellano and Tommy Bellotti lay outside the car, each shot by 6 bullets. According to Gravano, Gotti eased the car into the street and past the bodies sprawled on the pavement. He had to be sure Castellano was dead. Gravano's detailed account finally put an end to the speculating. As part of his plea bargain, Gravano testified against his former boss. He admitted to his role in 19 mob-related murders. He served 5 years in prison and voluntarily entered the Witness Protection Program. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted of 5 murders, including Paul Castellano's and Tommy Bilotta's. He also was found guilty of other crimes under the umbrella of obstruction of justice and racketeering. They included bribery of a police officer, jury tampering, gambling, bookmaking, tax evasion, and attempted murder. John Gotti lived out his life in federal custody, stripped of his audience, his expensive suits, and his flamboyant style. He died in a prison hospital on June 10th, 2002. The FBI crackdown on organized crime is working. Louis Schiliro, head of the New York office, is optimistic about New York's future.
People today, I think, can build a building in New York City without being shaken down by a Cosa Nostra family. I think a restaurant in New York City could have their garbage picked up without fearing that they will be shaken down if they don't pick a particular carter. People today can compete on the Fulton Fish Market without the necessity of paying off one of the particular New York crime families. So we've come a long way. There is certainly a lot of things that left to be done, but I think people generally in New York City certainly are starting to feel the effects of this effort.
The battle rages on in New York City. Mafia families continue to plunder, continue to kill. But because of the ceaseless efforts of the FBI, the people of New York are beginning to feel relief as more and more mobsters like John Gotti are taken off the streets. A serial killer was on the loose in western New York. He chose his victims for the color of their skin. The community was gripped by fear, not knowing when or where he would strike next. The only evidence he left behind was spent shell casings. To focus their search, local authorities called on an FBI profiler for help. They needed to stop his murderous rampage before the killer ended another life.
In Buffalo, New York, a sniper targeted African-American men. He held a city hostage and threatened to ignite a racial powder keg. And it looked like others might be following his bloody example. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. When it became clear that physical evidence alone wasn't enough to corner the killer, FBI profilers developed other means. Their work provided the only hope of flushing him out and connecting him to his crimes.
On September 22, 1980, in Buffalo, New York, Larry Robinson drove up to a supermarket with Glenn Dunn. Dunn promised to wait while Robinson went in to cash his paycheck. While he waited, Dunn decided to step out of the car for a cigarette. At about 9:45 p.m., psychiatric nurse Madonna Gorney just finished her shift. On her way home, she decided to pick up some groceries. Not far from where she parked, Gorney spotted Dunn fidgeting in the shadows. She was alone and felt unsafe. There had been robberies in the area, and Gorney did not want to be another victim. She headed straight for the lit entrance, where she passed another man who appeared to be waiting for a ride. Gorney felt safer once inside. Larry Robinson had only a short wait in line to collect his money. Looking for his ride, he noticed Dunn's car parked at the end of the building. When Robinson tried to get in, the door was locked. Dunn did not respond. Robinson came around to the driver's side and discovered Dunn was not moving. He was bleeding from the head. Robinson ran back into the store to summon help. When Madonna Gorney left the store, she noticed commotion at the end of the building and asked if she could be of any help. The security guard replied that it wasn't necessary. The situation was under control. With 3 bullet wounds to his head, Dunn was in critical condition. Paramedics struggled to save the young victim. His heart had stopped. Efforts to revive him were futile. He was pronounced dead on arrival. When police informed Dunn's family, they discovered he was only 14 years old. The forensics team searched for clues to the killer's identity. Fingerprints lifted from the car belonged to Dunn and Robinson. The blood was confirmed as Dunn's. The only trace left by the assailant was spent bullet casings. They had been fired from a .22 caliber weapon. A check of the car's license plates revealed it had been stolen the night before from a local dealer. Police questioned Robinson. He told them that he only knew Dunn casually from the neighborhood and did not know the car had been stolen. Robinson said he'd been walking to the supermarket earlier in the evening when Dunn drove up and offered a ride. Friends and family would later confirm that he and Dunn barely knew each other.
I'm here at the top supermarket.
The crime was already making news. As the story broke, Madonna Gorney returned home from the supermarket, still troubled by the incident.
But they did confirm that he is a 14-year-old local resident.
This guy that was sitting there.
Gorney was upset to learn that a young boy had been killed in the parking lot. She decided to call police the next morning to see if she could be of any help. Buffalo homicide detective John Regan initially thought the slaying might be a result of a car theft ring.
Exploring where the stolen car had come from and the people that may have been responsible for it, it became apparent that this was not the focal point of the investigation.
To develop leads, police canvassed nearby residents, hoping someone may have witnessed the shooting. A uniformed officer found a witness willing to cooperate and called a detective to question her. Barbara Wozniak lived next door to the supermarket. She told the detectives that she had heard the gunfire and seen the assailant.
Well, we just start from the beginning.
At around 9:45 on the previous evening, she was cooking when she heard 3 pop-like sounds. She hurried to her window to see what had caused the noises. She saw a white man running from a parked car. He wore a hooded sweatshirt that obscured his face. While the detective spoke to Wozniak, he was informed that a witness from the supermarket had called offering her help. It was psychiatric nurse Madonna Gorney.
The real reason I called was because a 14-year-old kid had been killed in that car the night before, and all I could think of at the time was, I'm a mother. If somebody killed my kid, I would really want to know who it was.
Gorney recounted what she had seen that night at the supermarket, hoping it would be of some help.
When I pulled in, I noticed a man standing under the lamppost near the edge of the parking lot. When I got out of the car, I purposely walked farther away from him with the idea that, yeah, I was alone, it was dark. If he was standing there, he was probably up to no good, and I didn't want to be part of it.
Anxious, Gorney looked for other people who might be of assistance if she were to become a victim of crime.
My first reaction was, wow, there is somebody else out here. As I walked closer to the door and was able to get a better look at him, I thought to myself, if something does happen, he's not going to be of any help to me, because basically he had a very dazed or very dopey look on his face, and I wasn't impressed.
She described him as a slender white man with dark hair who held a brown paper bag on his lap. He wore metal-rimmed glasses and a hooded sweatshirt which shadowed his features. The description seemed promising since the previous witness had described a similar man running from the scene. Detectives hoped that Gorney could provide details for a sketch. After talking to Gorney, Buffalo detectives got word of a similar shooting in the nearby suburb of Cheektowaga. The victim, 32-year-old Harold Green, was rushed into emergency surgery as detectives arrived at the hospital. His situation was critical after being shot in the left side of the head with .22 caliber slugs.
Are you with the Green family, man?
Detectives found his wife in the waiting room and asked what she knew of the shooting. Her husband had stopped at a fast food restaurant. He was sitting in his car eating his lunch when a hooded white assailant walked up and shot him. When an employee heard the gunfire and saw the shooter sprint from the scene with a brown paper bag, she called her manager. The method of this attack resembled the one from the night before. Detectives speculated that there was a possible connection between the two victims. Mrs. Green said neither she nor her husband knew Glenn Dunn or his family. Her husband was a successful engineer and a pillar in his community. He moved in different circles than the teenage car thief. Investigators found the two victims shared nothing in common. Green died without regaining consciousness. Only one piece of evidence linked both shootings. Lieutenant Thomas Rowan of the Cheektowaga Police Department led the forensic investigation.
We had our first piece of hard physical evidence that connected the shooting in Cheektowaga at the fast food restaurant, the shooting which took place in Buffalo, New York. That single fact that tied everything together was spent cartridge casings from a .22 caliber. At that point, it was only identified as a firearm because we didn't know what type of firearm had produced the spent shell casing.
That same night, homicide detectives were summoned to another shooting. It was the third attack on an African-American man in less than 36 hours. 31-year-old Emmanuel Thomas had been killed while crossing a residential intersection. From eyewitness accounts, the investigators pieced together the chain of events. An hour earlier, Frenchie Cook left the home of his friend Emmanuel Thomas. Thomas, a freelance house painter, told his wife he was going to the store and would be right back.
Be careful.
Neighbor Thomas Jackson saw the two friends walk by and head for the corner of East Ferry and Zenner Streets. As Thomas and Cook crossed the intersection, the killer struck from out of the darkness. With a gun concealed in a paper bag, he shot Thomas several times in the left side of the head. Thomas collapsed to the pavement. Frenchy Cook was in shock. He never saw the assailant approach. He did not know anyone that would want Emmanuel Thomas dead. A teenage witness who saw the shooting from across the street described the suspect as a hooded white male, around 5'8" or 5'9". The forensic team retrieved .22 caliber shells resembling those found from the previous shootings. They were sent to the lab for comparison. Detectives had little else to go on.
In this particular case, we had two common denominators. We had black men and we had a .22 caliber weapon that was used to kill them. Other than that, there were no connections between the victims, either collectively or even singly, and no connection with a shooter.
Startled investigators came to the realization that Buffalo had a serial killer on the loose. Police had no leads and only one apparent motive. Assistant District Attorney John DeFranks was called in to monitor the case.
We uncovered no evidence that there was a robbery motive. We uncovered no evidence that this was a situation involving bad blood between the attacker and the victim. What we had was an assassin randomly shooting people on the basis of race.
With the identity of the racist assassin unknown, the press dubbed him the .22 caliber killer. He was already on the prowl for his next victim. The .22 caliber killer was preying on African American men in Buffalo, New York, killing 3 in 36 hours and leaving little evidence behind. Emmanuel Thomas had been the killer's latest victim, gunned down crossing the street in front of his home. Medical examiners performed an autopsy. They found powder burns near the entry wounds. This meant that the muzzle of the murder weapon was placed close to his temple. From the pattern and severity of the burns, examiners believed they were caused by a sawed-off rifle. They removed 2 mangled .22 caliber slugs from his head and sent them to the ballistics lab for analysis. As investigators searched for answers, community fear turned into anger. Erie County District Attorney Ed Cosgrove was in charge of coordinating the hunt.
The black community demanded action by the police. And of course, because of the nature of the attacks and because of the psychotic nature of the person ultimately responsible, it wasn't going to be an easy task.
The next day, on September 24th, Joseph McCoy walked down a residential street in Niagara Falls, 20 miles north of Buffalo. In front of a church, the 43-year-old man was ambushed and killed. A witness described the shooter as a slender white man dressed in khakis. Once again, police found nothing but .22 caliber shells at the scene. The shells, along with the slugs extracted from the victim, were sent to the Erie County Department of Central Police Services to compare to the others. Lieutenant Thomas Rowan conducted the ballistics analysis.
In this case, it presented a rather difficult challenge to the firearms examiners and to law enforcement, is that the bullets themselves, as it went into the body, they broke up, they disintegrated, and broke into tiny little pieces, making specific identification of the weapon from the bullets inside of the victims very difficult, not impossible for the firearms examiners.
The shell casings could tell them more. Every gun leaves specific marks on a shell when it fires. The firing pin, ejector, and extractor from a weapon make impressions on the casings. For examiners, this is the gun's fingerprint. They found that the markings on the casings from the 4 crime scenes all matched.
The relationship of the firing pin impression, the ejector, and the extractor marks suggested fairly early on that a specific type of weapon was used, and that was a Ruger Model 1022.
The 4th shooting sent more shockwaves through the black community, and investigators still had no suspect. Local officials had no answers. They called on the FBI for assistance. Special Agent Chip Mrazowitz realized the case had the greatest urgency for the community.
It was important for the FBI to get involved in this case because there were African Americans being killed in the area, and everybody was scared to walk the streets, daytime and nighttime.
A composite sketch was rendered by an FBI artist who worked with several witnesses that had gotten glimpses of the killer. The sketch was circulated through patrols, newspapers, and television. Police also carried the sketch door to door, hoping that someone would recognize the suspect. When thousands of calls began to pour in, Detective Regan realized the composite did little to focus the investigation.
Basically, the composite sketch was like Everyman. As a result of it being published, I think we got somewhere around in the neighborhood of 6,000 calls that had to be checked out. And one of the fears really is that you may actually get the suspect, and because you've done so many of these, it becomes routine and you don't pay attention. That's the ultimate fear, that you go right by the man.
While local investigators tracked down leads in the Buffalo area, FBI agents pursued those outside of Erie County. Leads were followed in Pennsylvania, Ohio, all of New England, and across the border in Canada.
To have that many leads, we were occupied 24 hours a day. We were looking for one lone white male who possibly could be walking next to you in a street or having lunch with you at some cafeteria, and you don't know if you had the .22 caliber killer next to you.
On October 8, 1980, workers on a construction site in the Buffalo suburb of Amherst came across an abandoned taxi on the service road of the New York Thruway. When no one returned to move it, they contacted the state police. The trooper who responded inspected the empty cab. He found a wallet under the front seat that held a driver's license but no money. It belonged to 71-year-old Parler W. Edwards, an African-American cab driver. The keys were missing, and Edwards was nowhere in sight. The trooper decided to search the trunk, but found it locked.
No keys? Nothing.
Using a crowbar, he forced it open. He found the missing driver.
Parler Edwards was literally bludgeoned to death in a parking lot in the town of Cheektowaga. We found pieces of his skull, parts of his mouth, teeth that had been knocked out, a great deal of blood.
Before throwing Edwards' body into the trunk, the killer had also cut open the driver's chest and removed his heart. It wasn't clear that the Edwards slaying was connected to the others, since a .22 caliber rifle was not used.
The fact that he was a black male certainly raised suspicion in the minds of the investigators. Said, could the killer have now progressed to mutilation of the body in this case?
No one knew for sure. Perhaps it was an isolated incident perpetrated by a copycat killer. Manpower dedicated to the murders swelled to 150 personnel from various agencies. The hotline rang 24 hours a day, No calls led to a suspect. With community pressure mounting, the frustration grew for Special Agent Richard Faireye.
In this case, we had several crimes occurring. We had no evidence to indicate who that person was responsible. And for an investigator, it was extremely difficult for us to accept the fact that we could not find anything that could identify this person positively.
Early on October 9th, a water worker was driving towards a dock area in the town of Tonawanda, just a few miles from Buffalo. On the edge of the road, he spotted a man laying face down near the tall grass. The worker approached and saw that the man wasn't breathing. He immediately called authorities. They arrived within minutes. Investigators identified the victim as 41-year-old Ernest Jones. Like Edwards, Jones was a taxi driver who had his throat slashed and heart cut out before his body was moved to a remote location. He was the 6th African-American male to be murdered in the Buffalo area in less than 3 weeks. Authorities were baffled. With little evidence to guide them, they weren't sure if one person was responsible for all 6 homicides. Only one aspect linked the first 4 shootings with the deaths of the 2 cabbies.
Basically what you have is the 4 shootings which are definitely linked. You have the 2 cab drivers who are linked to each other, but not necessarily to this. There's controversy even within the police, within teams of investigators as to whether or not they're connected.
Agents and local authorities had no way of knowing if there were 1 or 2 serial killers out there killing black men. By October 9th, 1980, 6 African-American men had been found slain in the Buffalo area. Authorities were not certain that only one person was responsible. In just 3 weeks, the serial killings had split the local community along racial lines. District Attorney Edward Cosgrove led the investigation.
It's hard to even describe the community mind at that time. There were demands for action all over from the black community for the police to stop what was happening here. I had press conferences that were attended by the national press. Everybody descended upon Buffalo, and everybody wanted answers from me. I didn't have the answers.
The story made national headlines. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the .22 caliber killer. President Jimmy Carter took notice. With the wedge of civil rights violations dividing the Buffalo community, the president declared the investigation a federal case. Local lawmen now had the full resources of the FBI at their disposal. As federal agents began sifting through the collected information, another incident rocked upstate New York. On the night of October 10th, Colin Cole slept in Buffalo General Hospital. Cole was an inmate from a local jail recuperating from a drug overdose. Just as visiting hours were coming to a close, a man walked down the hall of the 7th floor looking for Cole's room. The recovering addict gasped for breath as the man tightened the ligature. A nurse administering medication surprised the strangler. He fled, leaving Cole alive. The nurse alerted hospital security. But the call came too late. It was the 7th attack on a black man in just 3 weeks. No one knew for sure if the .22 caliber killer was responsible for this attack.
What we have is this crime scene.
Lieutenant Thomas Rowan and his team had little understanding of serial killers at the time.
Glimpsing into the mind of a serial killer is like twinkling your toes into the abyss of the very weird. You're never really sure what's there.
Local investigators needed someone who was more familiar with these types of offenders. They called upon John Douglas of the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit to provide a profile of the .22 caliber killer. Through this process, Douglas would provide the team with insight to the killer's psychological behavior. Currently senior analyst of APBnews.com, an online crime news website, Douglas spent 20 years pioneering the science of profiling.
A profile is designed to come up with the most probable offender. Its goal is to eliminate a lot of false leads. An attempt is being made as well to maybe refocus the investigation of law enforcement, or possibly reinforce the investigation by telling them that you're on the right track here.
Douglas was on the next plane to Buffalo. During the trip, he familiarized himself with the case files.
You have to walk in the shoes of both the subject and walk in the shoes of that victim to truly understand really what took place during that assault. I'm going to be asking myself the question, why? Why this victim?
He confirmed what local investigators believed. The only connections among the 6 murder victims were their race and sex. They were black men who had been chosen by at least one killer as targets of opportunity. The strangled survivor, Colin Cole, was not a random victim since he had been sought out in his hospital room. The profiler believed Cole's attacker was at the very least a racist copycat, not necessarily responsible for any of the murders. Douglas needed to probe further. He had to meticulously recreate each murder from the known evidence. Reviewing all 6 attacks, the profiler looked for behavioral characteristics that could be ascribed to just one offender.
When you look at serial killers, you look at patterns as well as signature. Signature is something that the offender does. It's kind of repetitive behavior, but behavior that the subject has to do. It's more of a ritual.
Douglas found the behavior from each of the 4 shootings to be similar. The .22 caliber killer had surprised random victims, fired quickly from close range, then bolted, leaving his prey before they were dead. The assassin's signature was a blitz style of attack. The cabbie murders didn't seem to fit that pattern. In those 2 cases, the killer had severely bludgeoned the victims, mutilated them, then dumped them far from where they were killed. The killer had spent a great deal of time with the bodies, even after death. To Douglas, this suggested 2 different killers.
There are different types of serial killer. They're the very personal types of serial killers and the impersonal style and type of serial killer. The personal type of an offender wants to look in the eyes of the victim, and they want to spend hours, if at all possible, with their victims, be in a position of total control and domination. That's what really is going to turn them on.
It appeared that cabbies were murdered by a personal type of serial killer. Those crimes demonstrated a rage and overkill that were not evident in the shootings. Douglas believed that the psychopathology of the .22 caliber killer left a seemingly different behavioral thumbprint.
And the assassination style of serial killer are somewhere in an age group between 25 to 28 is when they first begin to surface. And how they could be described as really even more of an asocial type of personality, not so much antisocial, but asocial, keeping to themselves. They generally become obsessed with weapons. They may be found with having multiple weapons as well. The person would probably, if he was in the military, I said that he'd have difficulty in any branch of the service and would probably, at some point, would even receive a discharge.
To the profiler, it looked as if Western New York may have had 2 distinct serial killers on the loose. Douglas reported his findings to local investigators. Because the technique of profiling was new in 1980, a few had doubts about its reliability.
Some people look at this as this is some type of voodoo or witchcraft. I mean, how are you able to determine, for example, age of the offender? And actually, it's pretty easy once you do enough of these cases.
From his experience with similar cases, the profiler added that the .22 caliber killer would most likely be an avid hunter, having a history of menial jobs. Douglas stressed that it was up to the local team to find or eliminate suspects based on his profile.
This is a good tool, but really it's you. You're the people up there, you police, you're going to solve the case. I'm not going to solve the case. To me, this is the easy part. I'm just going to try to help you maybe refocus the case, give you an idea, paint a portrait of the offender, but really you're the one who's going to knock on the doors and wear out the leather soles and come up with the suspect.
A national all-points bulletin of the .22 caliber killer's profile was received by law enforcement agencies around the country. Investigators had a description, but still had no name. Late in 1980, the FBI and local police searched for leads in the unsolved murders of 6 black men from Western New York. Hoping to focus the massive investigation, an FBI profiler was called in to assess connections between the cases. He believed it was possible that 2 distinct racist killers were responsible. 2,000 suspects were interrogated, but police made no arrests. Buffalo wasn't the only city in New York State facing terror in the streets. 400 miles southeast, in New York City, a knife-wielding attacker was terrorizing Midtown. Commuter Ivan Frazier was the victim of a subway knifing 3 days before Christmas. Blocking the attack with his arm, he survived and reported the assault to the NYPD. At 1:25 in the afternoon, Ivan Frazier noticed another rider talking with an attractive woman. To Frazier, it appeared the man was trying to pick her up. The woman seemed annoyed. He got up to exit at the next stop. Frazier returned to his article. Without warning, the man across the aisle slashed Frazier in the forearm and wrist, then dashed away. He described the assailant as a white man in his early 30s with brown hair, wearing a blue jacket. 2 hours later, at 3:30 in the afternoon, 19-year-old Luis Rodriguez was walking on the west side of Midtown Manhattan when he was jumped by a white man demanding his wallet. Rodriguez fought off the initial blow, but the attacker lunged at him again, stabbing him twice in the chest. Before he died, Rodriguez described him to police as a white man with brown hair, wearing a blue jacket. 3 hours after Rodriguez, Antoine Davis was found stabbed to death in front of a Midtown bank. By 10:35 p.m., Richard Renner died in front of a hotel on 49th Street. He was also stabbed. By 11 p.m., the killer was back on the subway looking for another victim. He spotted Carl Ramsey. In the dim light, no one noticed the knife. Bleeding severely, Ramsey crawled out of the subway. By midnight, he was dead. In less than 24 hours, 4 black men were dead. The New York City press dubbed the killer the Midtown Slasher. The rash of attacks on black men in Manhattan had many similarities to the profile of the .22 caliber killer. New York City investigators called on John Douglas to provide a profile of the slasher.
Because I did an independent analysis, and when I started to paint a portrait of that person, my goodness, it was just like the Buffalo, New York case as well. We have a subject here approaching his victims, blitz style of attack.
There was one major difference. The Midtown slasher used a knife. The .22 caliber killer used a rifle.
Now, we don't have the 22 weapon, but maybe the reason for that is we don't have the 22 weapon because now we're dealing in areas that are very highly populated. If you have a 22 weapon, the sound of this would draw attention to himself.
Douglas determined that the signature behavior was identical. With a gun or a knife, the assailant attacked in the same way. By late December, District Attorney Cosgrove realized something else that bolstered the profiler's conclusion.
During that period of time, there had not been any assaults here in the city of Buffalo. It was quiet with respect to the activity of this .22 caliber assailant.
By the early weeks of 1981, the killer seemed to have disappeared. In January of 1981, the FBI and local investigators searched for the .22 caliber killer, wanted for the murders of at least 8 black men in New York City and Buffalo. Following months of investigation, Buffalo detective John Regan and his team were unable to come up with the name of a viable suspect.
The case is in limbo and everybody is frustrated. They don't know where to go. We don't have a name. We have no idea. Then out of the blue, there's a call made to the Buffalo Police Department homicide.
An officer from the Army's Criminal Investigative Division in Fort Benning, Georgia, made the call.
Interested in coming down and seeing what we have.
The Army was holding a 25-year-old Private Joseph Christopher on charges of assaulting a fellow soldier. On January 13th, 1981, Private Christopher attempted to stab an African-American enlistee. While he was in custody, Christopher tried to castrate himself with a razor. When Captain Dorothy Anderson began administering medical aid to the prisoner, he began muttering that he'd killed black men in the New York and Buffalo area. He didn't know the exact number of his victims. It was just something he had to do. Troubled by his story, Anderson reported it to the Army's Criminal Investigative Division. She told the CID officer of Christopher's ramblings. The CID officer remembered receiving an APB on the New York killings. He called the Buffalo Police Homicide Division as instructed by the teletype. For District Attorney Cosgrove, this explained why the killings had stopped in New York State.
From the time of our discovery of the second cab driver's gruesome death until almost Christmas of 1980, when we had the killings, the 4 killings in New York City, there had been a cessation of attacks. And apparently that was when Joseph Christopher was in the Army down in Georgia, as we later found out.
The FBI and the police finally had a name: Joseph Gerard Christopher. Agent Mrazowitz and his team compared Joseph Christopher's background to the .22 caliber killer profile.
He was pretty accurate. He described him as a white male, but early 30s, a loner. Possibly, if he were in the military, he would be hospitalized. He would be seeking psychiatric care. Prior to being in the military, he would have had menial-type labor. As soon as you had the name Joseph Gerard Christopher, you knew that that profile matched.
Investigators tracked down several friends and acquaintances of Christopher's.
Detective Lobb, talk to you a moment.
David Robinson had been a friend of the suspect for over a decade.
You familiar with a gentleman named Joseph Christopher?
They often shot target practice and went deer hunting together at Christopher's family cabin.
A little bit.
He also told investigators that Christopher had a gun collection that his father had left him when he died. The collection included a .22 Ruger rifle, but Robinson never saw one that was cut down.
We'd like to know where your son from is.
Investigators secured a search warrant for Christopher's last known residence. They arrived at his mother's house in Buffalo, New York on April 22nd, 1981.
Looks like our boys are real neat housekeepers, huh?
In Christopher's bedroom, FBI agents recovered metal-rimmed glasses and khaki clothing that matched witness accounts of the perpetrator's apparel. The FBI profile drawn up by John Douglas predicted the .22 caliber killer would be fascinated by guns and the military. The Christopher basement was an underground firing range. Agents found the inherited gun collection and portions of a sawed-off gun barrel. Among the paraphernalia, forensic specialists found boxes of .22 ammunition, a misfired .22 caliber cartridge, along with a rotary magazine. Ballistics specialist Thomas Rowan believed the evidence was significant.
Finding the rotary magazine for the 1022 Ruger was an important feature that supported a widely held theory throughout the investigation that the shooter specifically picked something so he could keep the profile of the weapon low enough to fit inside of a paper bag when he conducted these executions of these men on the street.
The rotary magazine enabled Christopher to have a full load of ammunition and allowed the sawed-off weapon to remain concealed in a bag without having to reload. A second warrant allowed investigators to search the family cabin in Ellington, New York. Detectives dug in the spot where Robinson told them he and Christopher shot rifles. The excavation yielded 2 shells, marred with a unique firing pin mark. The same marking was on the shells collected at the crime scenes. Firearm specialists of the Erie County Department of Central Police Services examined the shell casings that were found at the Christopher home and cabin. They compared them to the casings found at the first 4 crime scenes. They concluded that the shells were all fired from the same gun. With this match, Assistant District Attorney John DeFranks was able to get an indictment from a grand jury.
The casings spoke for themselves. Put the casing under the microscope, you had your evidence. It couldn't be altered or tainted.
Joseph Christopher was extradited from Georgia and returned to Buffalo, New York to stand trial. Officers fitted Christopher with a ski mask to prevent witnesses from identifying him through the media.
We put a mask on him for purposes of preventing potential witnesses from observing his face on the television and then basing their identification on that rather than upon their own recollection.
Okay. All right, thank you, Ms. Gorney, for coming down.
One of those key witnesses was Madonna Gorney. She had seen the .22 caliber killer the first night he struck in the parking lot of the supermarket. On May 5th, 1981, she confronted Joseph Christopher in a lineup.
It was a little scary. I was concerned with the possibility of being actually anyone in the lineup being able to see us who were there to identify someone in the lineup.
Gorney was protected by the bright lights that shone in the eyes of the subjects. She was able to identify Christopher in 2 different lineups. Agents and local police felt certain that they had the .22 caliber killer. Questions of Christopher's mental competency delayed the trial. In December 1981, a judge pronounced Joseph Christopher mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was committed to the Mid-Hudson State Psychiatric Center where he received treatment. On February 17, 1982, Christopher was deemed fit for prosecution. The trial began on April 6, 1982. The community watched every step the prosecution took.
The media reported this entire case on a day-to-day basis, sometimes on a minute-by-minute basis. It was good for the community because they wanted answers, they wanted information. And it was good for us because it began to convince the community that we had the right individual and that their fears could be somewhat allayed.
The state jury found Joseph Christopher guilty for the murders of Glenn Dunn, Harold Green, and Emmanuel Thomas. He was sentenced to 60 years to life imprisonment. Prosecutors never tried him for the Manhattan knifings. One question still remained. Was Christopher also the taxicab slasher? Though the FBI profile excluded Christopher as the suspect, he later revealed details of the cab driver's wounds that only the killer could have known.
We wanted to make sure here in Buffalo and every county that we satisfied the community's need for professionalism, thoroughness, competence, and all the other things that the community expects of its policemen and prosecutors. And we were able to satisfy that need because we were successful.
Through science and good detective work, Joseph Christopher would never be free to kill again. He spent the rest of his life behind bars until his death, curiously, from a rare form of male breast cancer at the age of 37.